Hey, thank you so much for coming out. This is really exciting. This is the first large audience I've seen anywhere since we've reemerged from 2 years of sweatpants. Thank you so much to the English department and to Claudia Bester and all her partners at the Hammer Museum for making our series possible. Thank you so much to Geoff Dyer for coming. Geoff, from what I've ascertained from Wikipedia, is the only child of a sheet metal worker and a school dinner lady. We like that, we're Americans, we're big on that, who got a scholarship to Oxford. And after Oxford, as you will learn when you read this wonderful book we're here to celebrate tonight, he tried to, the only thing he could think of was proposing a research grant, and he thought of proposing the idea of how novels end. He mentioned The Sense of an Ending, that great book by Kermode, and Great Expectations. He was talking about the history and development of something or other, but as he said, but I was not interested in making a contribution to knowledge, I was interested in getting a grant. With my formal education and academic aspirations at an end, I drifted into the life of unsupervised and unfocused study to which I was perfectly suited, signing on the dole, reading a lot, listening to music, going to the cinema, and drinking beer. Gradually, I weaned myself off the dole, but essentially my life has continued on the same trajectory, a trajectory, if such a thing is possible, without direction or purpose ever since. For those of you who are my writing students, that's a perfectly honorable and time-worn way to become a writer. Geoff is the author of 4 novels, Geoff in Venice being one of my favorites, a study of John Berger, 2 collections of essays, one of which entitled, otherwise known as The Human Condition, won the National Book Critics Circle Award. He's won a whole bunch of other awards, which I'm not going to mention because you could Google that yourself. But what I really would like to celebrate here tonight is not even his books of essays or his novels, though they're wonderful and you should read them, but his meditations. He's formed this genre, which is all his own, which is part personal essay, but part deep meditations on various subjects which have a sort of underlying story. And the underlying story of this particular book is about last things. He says it's about last things, some of which are last, while some are precociously early. And not that this was ever intended to be a comprehensive study of last things or of lastness generally. It's about congeries of experience, things, and cultural artifacts that for various reasons have come to group themselves around me in a rough constellation during a phase of my life. Though not my last, hopefully, we hoped so too, this phase is marked by a daily increasing consciousness that the next may well be, so much so that I feel I'd better get this done now in case it comes around sooner than I think, or that the last phase, whenever it comes, might be distinguished by an inability on my part to identify or articulate it. He says in another part of the book, it's often said that writers have only 1 or 2 themes which they consistently return to, finding new ways of addressing them, new fictional situations in which they can be explored. My theme, I have no doubt, is giving up. That's what's kept me going. If you haven't already guessed, Geoff Dyer is an extremely funny writer. He was talking today to my students and mentioned that he at one point managed to get a joke in the fourth line or the 4th paragraph of the preface. I would say he got a joke in the title of the book, Yoga for People Who Can't Be Bothered to Do It. And that says a lot about Geoff Dyer. He's both deep and he's joyous. He's immensely funny. We'll talk more about humor later, but I'm really excited. He's translated into 24 languages. He's been honored very many places, and it's an oversight that we haven't had him read in our series before now. Thank you so much for coming. Welcome, Geoff Dyer.
Wowee, thank you, Mona. That was a lovely introduction, and thank you all for coming. It really is, or the publishers were saying, you know, there's no point doing events. Nobody wants to come out. Well, who's laughing now? I'm so enormously relieved that there's, sorry, it looks like I'm about to take a photograph, but I'm just setting the timer so I know when to start. Okay, so yeah, as Mona said, this is a book about last things, and since there's so many of you here, I'll sort of you'll have the happy experience. I'm going to explain to you it will be revealed the main kind of plot point of this book, which is a book of exactly 86,400 words, and tonight you will discover why that's the case. So that, I think, has engaged your attention. And also, I wanted to give you a sense of the structure of the book. Not this structureless, random kind of thing of sections thrown together, as you might have been led to believe if you'd read certain reviews. No, you're gonna get a sense of the structure of things. So I'll read some bits from early in the book, I think, and yeah, I think this should all be self-explanatory, actually. So they're very short sections, but I won't indicate to you when a given section ends. In 2013, I arrived at Miami Airport to give a reading at Stetson University in Florida. My host, the writer Mark Powell, was waiting at the baggage carousel. As we walked to his car, he asked if it would be okay if the pause made me worry that he was going to propose something untoward, something seriously inconvenient. The thing was, he continued, his mother was arriving shortly in another terminal, and would it be okay if we waited to pick her up too? Of course, that was fine, I said, and it really was, since her flight got in right on time, and soon the three of us were exiting the airport in a cool and spacious car. It was still a bit awkward because in that scrupulously polite American way, this charming elderly lady insisted on sitting in the back and calling me Mr. Dyer. And it felt so silly to say, please call me Geoff, that we'd had quite a few exchanges over the course of several miles before I was able to find a way of doing so without sounding inversely grand. It was going to be a long drive, and after a half an hour of nice chat, Mark asked if we'd like to listen to some music. This seemed a lovely idea, and he played a CD on the car's immaculate sound system of a woman singing about Tennessee and Dixie, the kind of alt-country bollocks I couldn't bear, but that I now fell instantly in love with. It was such a perfect soundtrack that the three of us were suddenly starring in the early stages of a low-budget indie movie in which a tweedy English professor, I was neither tweedy nor professorial, but in the film version this would be an understandable adjustment of the facts. This tweedy English professor is due to give a dreary lecture on Tennyson or Wordsworth at an American college campus, but then, due to a series of not too dramatic, non-deliverance style mishaps, ends up going instead on a long road trip with his host and the host's mom, shedding his tweed jacket in favour of cowboy shirt and hat along the way, climaxing with a triumphant reading in Nashville at the Grand Ole Opry. That's how I first heard Gillian Welch in 2013, which means I encountered her embarrassingly late. One of many reasons she's so wonderful is because, well, I was going to say because of her deep immersion in Dylan, but since so many people are immersed in Dylan, that's not accurate. It's because she's taken from Dylan in a very Dylan-like way, not least his magpie ability to pick and choose bits of Americana from the past. There are also the vocal stretches and slurs, the elliptical nature of the songs, and, on occasions, what seem direct allusions to his stuff. Maybe it's just me, but the way she sings Fortune Lady on Revelator seems like a direct summons across time to the fortune-telling lady on Desolation Row. It's tempting to claim that with this line, Dylan actually predicts Welch's future allusion to it. On One Monkey, she drawls repeatedly, "Here comes a slow train." It's never made clear where this train might be heading, but we can in no doubt can hear exactly where it's come from. And then there's Lowlands, a response to either his sad-eyed lady of the or his Highlands, regarded by some as Dylan's own response to the earlier song. Nietzsche's great luck, according to E.M. Choran, was to have ended as he did, in euphoria. Choran, who ended up hollowed out by dementia, is not referring to the end of Nietzsche's actual life on the 25th of August 1900, after more than a decade spent being cared for, at first by his mother and then preserved as a helpless effigy by his sister. Elizabeth assumed control not just of her brother's body, but tragically of his body of work, overseeing the transformation of a writer who had written of, quote, the accursed anti-Semitism that had been the reason for a radical break between me and my sister, and whose final semi-coherent words included the claim that he was having all anti-Semites shot into someone indelibly associated with Hitler and Nazism. Visitors to the Nietzsche villa in Weimar, which became home to the incapacitated philosopher, his sister, and the archive she controlled, would hear howls from the room where Nietzsche lay upstairs, shrieks that sounded like expressions of psychic agony, but which contained no meaning beyond the biological fact that he was alive and producing them, without any tormenting memory or residue of extinguished insight and ruined lucidity. Eminent or especially devoted pilgrims would be taken up to see him, propped or lying in a white gown which made him look like a guru, but also to us like himself, since it's from this phase of his life that the iconic portraits were sketched by Hans Older and reproduced on the Penguin Classics edition of Thus Spoke Zarathustra. In August 1888, in a postscript to a long letter, Nietzsche wrote that some people are born posthumously. But the last decade of his life raises the appalling prospect that posthumous life can start while one is still notionally alive. And he was ready for this. One pays dearly for immortality, he had written. One has to die several times while alive. So Choran is referring not to the end of Nietzsche's life, but to the phase that came to an end on the 3rd of January 1889 in Turin, when he saw a taxi driver beating his horse. Nietzsche flung his arms around the horse and collapsed. He regained consciousness, but never his sanity. In the period leading up to this, the sky in Turin had grown brighter in tandem with a massive darkening, as happens when the sun makes looming clouds blaze with radiant blackness. Written in less than 3 weeks between the 15th of October and the 4th of November 1888, Ecce Homo teeters like this, brilliantly, frighteningly, absurdly, comically, grandly, sadly, on the very brink of collapse. Light, in the letters written shortly before his breakdown, flickers briefly before being consumed, often in the next sentence, by nonsense and darkness. On the 5th of January, in a burst of impenetrable lucidity, he writes, "I am every name in history." I've no idea what this means, but I remember first coming across it, quoted by an author whose name I can no longer recall, in a passage about the scrupulous listing of the names of the dead on First World War memorials. So it seems that this line of Nietzsche's, like so much else that he wrote, has a prophetic quality, or, more subtly, the proleptic ability to suggest a time in the future when the past is present as a continuous echo. This is a symptom, or at least a side effect, of what Nietzsche considered to be his most important idea, the eternal recurrence. Every moment of the life we lead, he claimed, will be lived over and over throughout all eternity. If we give ourselves to this concept, there is, nor can there be, any end. Since the recurrence insists that every moment is endlessly relived, Nietzsche's final phase of euphoria, a mix of delusion and lucidity, will fade in an instant and be followed by the decades spent as a drooling zombie, and then by his boyhood, by the long days and nights of his loneliest loneliness, the constant illnesses and headaches, the renewed hopes followed always by fresh disappointments, the gradually increasing sense of having been catastrophically overlooked, and the attendant swelling sense of megalomania. The only thing not included in this endless carousel would be confirmation of his eventual posthumous global fame and influence, the satisfaction of knowing that everything he predicted for himself, even in his most delusional moments, would come to pass. The gain? That he'd be spared all knowledge of the day on the 2nd of November 1933, when Hitler made a ceremonial visit to the archive, where Elizabeth presented him with her brother's walking stick. The prospect of his sister Elizabeth's constant reappearance was, he wrote in Ecce Homo, the most abysmal aspect of the eternal recurrence. Many commentators, especially academics, have found the idea of the eternal recurrence puzzling. Lacking any necessary training in philosophy, I took to it like a duck to water. Paradoxically, the eternal recurrence of all things insists that we have only one life. It's a formulation that offers no alternative to our being saddled with and sealed completely within this life. Not only is there no afterlife, but crucially, there is no escape in death, no way of downgrading what happens by claiming that, however terrible life might be, it will at some point be over and done with. It's unprovable, and yet from time to time, always at unexpected moments, we get an elusive sense that we have lived our life before, and, according to Nietzsche, will do so again and again. That was one of the first things that struck me about Nietzsche, the way the eternal recurrence offered an explanation of the sensation of déjà vu, the flicker that is both premonition and memory. The strangest aspect of déjà vu is the way that the sensation always extends slightly beyond the moment when we've registered it as such, so that it includes our saying, I've just had a déjà vu. And we are briefly locked into the loop of the moment, just as we are locked into endless loops of life. The film Groundhog Day flirts with the premise of the eternal recurrence, but permits a slight improvement or learning over time with each repetition. But the best filmic representation of the idea is Christian Marclay's The Clock. Exactly the same 24 hours forever, with multiple climaxes along the way, but no finale on the hour, at noon, or even at the end of the day at midnight, and no pause. Moments after midnight, the same day, the same endless loop of 86,400 seconds is already rolling round again. That was the big reveal, by the way. Turin is one of those cities that, for various reasons, I'm always returning to. The first time I was there in the early 1990s, I headed as soon as possible to Piazza Carlo Alberto, where Nietzsche had lived. A plaque on the wall explained, in my rough translation, that in this house, Federico Nietzsche knew the fullness of spirit that challenges the unknown, the will to power that drives the hero. Here, as attests his high destiny and genius, he wrote Ecce Homo, the book of his life. in memory of the creative hours, spring, autumn 1888, at the centennial of his birth, the city of Turin placed this memorial, the 15th of October, 1944. So although it was erected after the fall of Mussolini, who, unlike Hitler, had in his youth been a connoisseur and admirer of Nietzsche, it honoured him in terms associated with fascism. Still, at least there was a memorial, and each time I returned to the city, I passed by it, sometimes accidentally. In 2013, I was in Turin for a jazz festival and found that I was strolling through a familiar square rendered briefly unfamiliar by extensive renovation. Blue corrugated fencing had cordoned off a section of the building at the corner of what I realized was Piazza Carlo Alberto. In a sod's law way, I thought that the plaque would be behind this cordon, thereby denying the pilgrim the confirmation that he craves. And then I saw it on the corner of the street where I'd entered the square. The upheaval of building work made it more obvious than ever that a new memorial was needed to free Nietzsche from the wartime, quasi-fascistic bombast of the hero and the will to power. Instead, there should be a sculpture of the moment when he threw his arms around the poor horse being beaten by its driver. It wouldn't have to be a realist sculpture, but that episode would be the defining part of the commission. Standing there, I conceived the idea of a competition inviting sculptors to come up for ideas for exactly such an artwork. I was already thinking like an influential member of the Turin City Council, but almost instantly I saw that it would be better if one were mayor of Turin, or ideally a dictator with untrammeled powers so as to cut down on the preliminary bureaucratic rigmarole that attends a major undertaking such as this. Perhaps this is where the will to power starts to make itself felt. The belief that you are right, that it's so obviously the best thing to do, to erect a statue of Nietzsche in a public square, that the opinions of others are no more than a hindrance to be trampled down and clambered over as quickly and ruthlessly as possible. And it so clearly was a good idea, since in the middle of the square there's already an equine statue, some generalissimo on a horse, on a plinth, sword raised, going somewhere, but in the way of these statues, going nevertheless. He's facing the National Museum, wearing one of those old-fashioned, whatever they're called, hats. Turin, like most major cities in Europe, is full of this stuff. Putting up third-rate statues like this is part of the project and one of the rewards of achieving nationhood. But this rote bit of statuary would be revived and improved when offset by the Nietzsche statue, which, this was emerging as another part of the brief, would be A, at ground level rather than on a pedestal, B, life-size, C, tucked discreetly into a corner, in accordance with the way that Nietzsche created his earth-changing work while living in almost complete obscurity. This was a marvellous idea, and one to which the council would be sympathetic, because although the square was dominated by this old statue, part of it was given over to a temporary exhibition of ecological posters for public transport and cycling. The new Nietzsche monument, which would be anything but monumental, would be in keeping with this mood, signalling the transition from conquest of nature, as represented by the military man astride his horse, to reconciliation with it as the philosopher threw his arms around the horse's neck. It would also embody the transition in Nietzsche's reputation from hero and promulgator of the Superman to man of compassion, to proto-horse whisperer, even if there's no sign in his writing that he even gave a rat's ass about ill-treated animals. The irony is that although the whipped horsey must have welcomed Nietzsche's intervention, really it was poor Nietzsche who was in need of help, compassion, and love. Maybe, I thought, as if I were now not just organizing and judging the competition, but in the way of dictators submitting my own proposal for what would turn out to be the winning entry by a unanimous decision, it would be possible to create a statue in which horse and man held each other in a mutually consoling embrace. I walked on, simultaneously animated by this project of public works and eco-urban renewal, and disinclined to do anything further about it, except imagining the grand opening ceremony and unveiling, to be followed by a screening later that same night of Bela Tarr's last film, The Turin Horse, which I'd never had the patience to sit through. It doesn't matter that it's impossible to know exactly what happened in the Piazza Carlo Alberto on that January day in 1889. Attempts to trace the story of Nietzsche embracing the beaten horse back through its various retellings have found no corroboration from reliable witnesses and contemporary sources, but neither has it been contradicted by established facts. We are in the realm of myth that sustained its own truth. This version of what happened corresponds to the reality it created, as should the statue commemorating the day's events. And it should do something else too, recognize Nietzsche's achievement while also emphasizing his abysmal failure, a failure and eventual change in fortunes as seismic as Van Gogh's. In 1886, half of the print run of 1,000 copies of the first volume of Human All Too Human had been sold, which was better than a third of Volume 2 and 1/5 of The Wanderer and His Shadow. None of the Zarathustra volumes had sold more than 1,000 copies. Compare that with 1914, when 150,000 copies of a special pocket-sized edition were printed for German soldiers to take into battle. The cruel irony is that as Nietzsche was on the brink of losing his mind, he was on the brink of finding the appreciative readership that had been denied him. In 1888, a Danish scholar gave a series of lectures on his work. Suddenly, writes Richard Wallin, Nietzsche's name was on the lips of all Copenhagen. That sounds an almost comically modest claim, but these lectures were the start of an eventual sea change in Nietzsche's fortune and sufficient encouragement to a writer starved of all acclaim to persuade him of how widely read he was and how highly regarded in the rest of the world. I have even real geniuses among my readers, in Vienna, in St. Petersburg, in Stockholm, in Copenhagen, in Paris and New York. I've been discovered everywhere, he wrote. Obliged in Ecce Homo to accept that he had not yet been discovered in Europe's flatland, Germany, he took his lack of recognition there as further proof in Twilight of the Idols of why increasingly Germany counts as Europe's flatland. This was in stark contrast to that lofty peak, 6,000 feet beyond man and time, where the idea of the eternal recurrence had first come to him. In the gay science, he injected a note of compromise in his Manichaean opposition of the lofty and the low. Stay not where the lowlands are, climb not into the sky. The world looks best by far when viewed from halfway high. The first 2 days of my visit to Turin in 2013 were rainy. Enrico Rava had played in one of the main squares on Friday night in a massive downpour, but Sunday was dry, cloudy, warm. I'd sung for my supper the previous afternoon in the form of a poorly attended reading. I'd had the whole day to myself before flying back to London later that evening. Sated with jazz, I walked through the city, listening to Gillian Welch's Lowlands. With its deliberately plodding drum beat, Lowlands is a song about depression. What is this weight on my mind, she sings. It's about how, after a point, one can become so accustomed to it as to forget one is depressed, can assume this state to be the normal, unenthusiastic response to and condition of life. And not only that, you can come almost to like it, to take comfort in the dead weight of its familiarity. It's like Nietzsche's time in Rome, when in the spring of 1883 he said that he merely put up with life, in sharp opposition to what a recent biographer calls the sunlit uplands of his permanently joyful mood in Turin. Possibilities, escape, romance, new vistas beckon. But while D.H. Lawrence was able to declare ecstatically, "A fine wind is blowing the new direction of time," Gillian Welch, perplexed, can ask only, what is this new sense of time? If it's a symptom of depression to blame others for your situation, for things that have gone wrong, then it's a sign of potential recovery when Welch acknowledges that it's no one else's, no one's fault but my own. There's no uplift at the end, no surge through to the convalescence celebrated by Nietzsche in The Gay Science, a sudden sense and anticipation of a future. But it's a song. It's sung by Gillian in always lovely harmony with Dave Rawlings, so its explicit resignation contains a hypnotic reassurance of receptiveness to beauty and all that implies. The song generates the possibility of leaving the lowlands behind, even while staying in them. I walked through the city, and as can happen when you listen to a song over and over like this, it seemed to describe my state exactly. Except, by virtue of song and setting, it became an elevating experience. I think we'll leave Nietzsche there in Nietzsche and Gillian Welch in Turin. And just before we move on to my chat with Mona, I've just got this nice little section to read. I say it's little, but, well, wait and see. I hope you've all had dinner, because it's, it could be a while. Anyway, this is how it goes. At any poetry reading, however enjoyable, the words we most look forward to hearing are always the same. I'll read 2 more poems. The words we truly long for, I'll read 1 more poem, but 2 seems to be the conventionally agreed minimum. It's lovely hearing this. You can feel a sigh of relief passing through the audience, especially if the previous couple of poems have been precedent-setting sonnets clocking in at under a minute each. After long months in the sea of poetry, the shout has gone up from the crow's nest. Land! We're almost there. We've made it. Can practically taste the scurvy-healing lager being poured in a bar afterwards. But then these 2 last poems turn out to be the opposite of the sonnets that had served as a double false dawn before the concluding multi-part epics. The felt duration of each is twice as long as Robert Browning's 400-page The Ring and the Book. Which raises a question. Why did we come if, while being here, we'd end up being so preoccupied by no longer being there? Could it be that our deepest desire is for everything to be over with? We want encores, value for money, bang for our buck, but however vigorously we've been clapping and clamouring for more, there's invariably a sense of relief when it becomes clear that the band, despite our collective imploring, are not coming back. That the house lights have flicked on, bringing the last residue of applause to an immediate, slightly impolite halt, and that we can apply ourselves single-mindedly to getting a good place in the stampede for the exits. Beneath it all, writes Philip Larkin, desire of oblivion runs. So, that wasn't too long, was it? Okay, thank you. So, yeah.
Thank you very much. That was wonderful. I don't know if we should start out talking about humor or structure.
Either.
Either. Let's start with structure. Tell us a little bit about. I noticed that that was a wonderful piece you read about Nietzsche tonight, and throughout the book there's a sort of recurrences, you might say, eternal
Yeah.
recurrences of Nietzsche. You know, there are and several other. Lawrence comes up again and again, and there's these leitmotifs that. Did you, when you originally wrote the book, did you write did you go through a Nietzsche period, and was that all in one clump, and then did you then disperse it structurally, or how did you arrange the structure of this book?
Yeah, God, I mean, I would just love to talk about the structure, the masterly structure of this book for absolutely hours. So, yeah, Nietzsche is one of 2 or 3 central figures. I mean, the others being Beethoven and Turner, I think. Anyway, so once I'd accumulated a certain amount of material, loosely about this thing of things ending, not just people's careers, but things that one comes to late in life, you know, all sorts of stuff. Then I started to want to organize it in some way, because I should say there's no introduction in this book. You just plunge straight in. And I started to sort of organize the material, and with this thing of the eternal recurrence, this loop, and I also discuss William Basinski's disintegration loops. I liked the idea of some kind of loop, and I thought that maybe I could have sections of 60 parts, 60 loops, loops of 60 parts. And of course, you get that, you know, once you get 60, then you're in the realm of time, of 60 seconds or 60 minutes. So I liked the idea of a series of loops, and the reason I wanted to read you those sections is to show that there is a kind of narrative. We move on, but then, you know, we're also sort of looping backwards. So, you know, we start with Gillian Welch, and then we abandon her, and we're on to Turin, and, you know, by then you might think, you know, what on earth was, you know, what's happened there? And the Gillian Welch bit is left suspended, and then we sort of loop back to that, and then the narrative moves on again. So I very much liked the idea of loops like that in these things of 60. And then that also sets up nice little sort of deja vus, really. So I started really... So, I mean, this is a book of sprawling concerns, but something had to hold it together. And so, for example, there's a bit during COVID, I talk about the way that before the pandemic, I lived the life of a kind of coolish, middle-aged person. I really did. No sniggering at the back. I really did. And then once the pandemic hit, I seemed to sort of have accelerated through late middle age into sort of living like a pensioner, just going for a daily walk. And there's a bit where I say, you know, I'm walking along the beach, going past two young, I think I used the word girls, 2 girls sitting in the sand who look up at me as if to say, who is that old man? So at that point, the reader's thinking, oh, you know, pervert, quite reasonably. But it's actually not me being a pervert, it's me being clever. Because that sets up something that occurs later when I'm talking about Tennyson's work, when he's walking along the beach in the Isle of Wight, and he goes past these two girls who are sitting there, and he overhears one say to the other, did that old man write Maud? And, okay, so that's no big deal in itself, but there's lots of these little sort of phrases and things that come back in a kind of musical-like way to hold things together. And gradually, I hope that there's a kind of a relationship of sort of ties linking the variously disparate things together. And then finally, as I was going through the book and enjoying the revising of it, and was really wanting to, you know, find a way of just giving it this kind of a form that was linked to its conceptual center, let's say. I looked and saw that there was, you know, I had maybe about 92,000 words, and then I realized that I could, with a bit of cutting and stuff, I thought, oh, well, I'll make it, if I make it 86,400 words, that'll be the exact number of words that there are seconds in the day, which take us right back to that description of the Christian Marclay, which, you know, goes looping around. So, I mean...
I hope people saw at LACMA a couple years ago. That was
which is so great. Anyway, so that's some of the things that were going on. I should also mention that one of the sort of inspirational books for me was Adam Jagodziewski's Slight Exaggeration, a book which again has no introduction. It just doesn't really have any central concern. This book of mine is concerned with last things, but Jagodziewski's book is held together just by his sort of tone, a tone very, very different to mine, of course, and by his sort of consciousness. And really this subject of lastness and this structure that I give it, that would be my, that's me reminding, I was ahead of schedule. I could have droned on a bit longer with that reading. Just becomes a sort of a container, if you like, for a way of concentrating my consciousness, in the same way that, goodness knows, on a altogether vaster scale, Yugoslavia becomes the container for, over the course of 1,200 pages, what is really, Rebecca West's deep exploration of her consciousness in Black Lamb, Grey Falcon.
I also wanted to talk about humor. This book said that a sense of humor is about so much more than being funny. It's an entire relation to and view of the world. Can you talk about this comic world?
Yes, and I should.
Isn't comedy usually associated with endings, with certain kind of endings?
Oh yeah, it certainly can be. I think of that great joke that somebody told Richard Kapuscinski on his deathbed. He told this story of it's somebody who gets knocked down by a truck in Warsaw, and the ambulance comes to pick him up, and he thinks he's going to the hospital, and he doesn't recognize it. He says to the driver, where are you taking me? And he says, to the morgue. And the guy says, yeah, but I'm not dead yet. And the driver says, yeah, but we haven't got there yet. I mean, it seems to me that's about endings. It's a profound joke, and it's also an expression of a sort of Middle European worldview, I think, born of God knows how much tragedy. But yeah, I mean, the truth is that normally I so worry that if I don't hear people laughing, I worry that everyone's fallen asleep. So it was actually a huge act of discipline of me to read a sort of serious piece tonight. Well,
Supposed to say the shampoo.
yeah, as opposed to, because it's so reassuring when people are laughing, because then they haven't nodded off. But in a sense, I'm there. By doing that, I'm relying on a distinction which I resist, which is that, I think it's G.K. Chesterton who said, we have to remember the opposite of funny is not serious. The opposite of funny is not funny, because I realized that just as in conversation, of course, we like that thing of we don't want to be condemned to a life just of wisecracking. That would just be dreadful, and, of course. But equally, typically in conversation, we like that shifting back and forth between serious and joking. And so I think what's happened is that as I've sort of developed as a writer, so I've done that thing whereby there'll be a sort of serious point in one sentence, and then it'll be undercut by a sort of a joke in the next part, and then we'll be flipping back and forth. And then we'll be flipping back and forth, as it were, at such a rate that there becomes a point where there's no difference at all between what's a joke and what's serious. And that, for me, is a very, very lovely reading experience, because it becomes a kind of tightrope, really. And I guess one could also, maybe say, going back to this thing of form, as I say, there's no introduction explaining what's going on. So I think the reader of this book is sort of wondering sometimes, what sort of book is this? What's going on here? How does it want to be read? And then, sometimes, when it's that nice thing where you can't tell whether something, you're not quite sure whether something's a joke or not, or the joke is, you know, is somewhat risky, and, you know, should that joke have been made? And, you know, I mean, I don't want to be, you know, I'm from England, and I so remember when I first moved to Los Angeles of that kind of thing, that a typical sentence would end normally with a period. But quite often I found that my sentences were ending instead not with a period, but with comma, no, I'm joking, period. Because of that very, very deadpan sort of English delivery, which is, that's the tone of my heart, as it were.
You mentioned in the book you mentioned in the book that you found yourself doing that even with your wife during COVID. That there was a greater sense of not getting each other's jokes during the pandemic and during the lockdown.
Slightly different, actually, Mona. It's that weird way that emails and text completely filter out all humour. And so tonally, we would be, we'd be texting each other. And for the first time ever with my friends, we'd be saying to each other, are you joking? Or, and this to me was a glimpse of this hellish and, of course, easily offended life of the humorless.
Can you reveal a little bit, not to spoil anything, but could you reveal a little bit about the shampoo caper?
Oh, well, I suppose, there's another line of Nietzsche's that's quite important. Nietzsche is full of jokes, actually, and he says, that the most profound mind might also be the most frivolous, is a sign of greatness to him. And I have a great fondness for that, that observation of Annie Dillard's, who, is obsessed with Thoreau, and she worries for ages about, what is Walden about, and of course we could have a whole seminar on this. And then there's that wonderful moment as a graduate student when Annie Dillard decides that ultimately Walden is a book about a pond. So there's and that comes in the context of me writing in this sort of stuff about my sort of this great project that I had about just always stealing those little bottles of shampoo from hotels, and it's a really trivial kind of thing in a way, but I actually suspect that it addresses something about what gives our lives purpose. So I talk about the way that we were this started when we were flying back from somewhere, and then so that was all fine, and because now they try to stop you taking the little bottles of shampoo. They have these big dispensers bolted to the wall, but it happened that we had a glucosamine container, so we pumped it into there. And then when we were staying at the Skyview up in Los Alamos, we drove up there, and we actually ended up filling a kind of big water bottle with. And it was, I don't want to boast about how rich I am, but I could just go into CVS and I could just buy a gallon of shampoo. No, but it was just
the thrill of it.
It just gave my life a sense of purpose. Which it might otherwise. It gave my life the illusion of purpose, let's say.
I found myself wondering if you hadn't been a writer, if you wouldn't have. I wonder if you took it further than you would have otherwise, because you knew you would be writing about it.
Oh, yeah. Well,
It's so funny.
Yeah, no. The project preceded the writing about it, but I was much more seriously committed to it than my wife, because frankly she's got more important things on her mind.
And you also mentioned that at one point her hair smelled fishy because you'd left a sort of a...
Oh, I'd left some a tablet of omega fish oil in the... She kept saying, my hair smells fishy, and I'd be saying, well, that's because you're losing your mind. But it turns out, no, we discovered anyway, yeah.
There's a motif throughout the book of your various injuries, which either do prevent you or don't prevent you from playing tennis at various times.
Yeah.
Which is also a mild suspense in the book, which is bookended by two tennis players.
Oh yeah, goodness knows. I mean, yeah. So if anyone thought this was a book about tennis and you've bought the book, I'm afraid no refunds are available. So you know, it's I mean, just today. I mean, I don't know if you saw the very moving scenes when Joe Wilfried Tsonga announced his retirement at Roland Garros, and you know, this thing of injuries taking their toll. But it's, I mean, one of the things I had to be really careful about is that the book didn't just become a kind of injury diary or a sprain journal, because, you know, endlessly fascinating though that is to those suffering from it, it's not necessarily so interesting to other people, although I say that, and that contradicts one of my basic, you know, real items of faith as a writer, you know, which is that if you can remain true to the contingencies of your own experiences and the vagaries of your own nature, and you can talk about really trivial things, then the chances are they will be shared by other people. But I cut out quite a lot of the moaning and groaning about how much my knees were hurting.
I could go on forever. I'd love to ask you about Burning Man. There's a lot about Burning Man, which is hilarious also. I'd like to ask about quitting marijuana. I'd like to ask about all these things, but I know the audience has a lot of questions, so I want to turn over to them now. The way we do it here is we record these sessions, so if you could raise your hand, I'll call on you, and someone will come around with the microphone so we can be sure that your question is adequately heard on the recording. Questions, please. Let's start with over there.
Hi. You mentioned that you're quite a big fan of Nietzsche's idea of the eternal return. I was wondering how you feel about the fairly popular response to that from Milan Kundera and the eternal lightness of being, and who you think kind of wins that debate, or if there is one.
Callum, could you speak up a little?
Sure.
Did everybody hear all that?
Yeah, I was wondering how you feel about Milan Kundera's response to Nietzsche's eternal return, and who you think wins that debate, if there is one, really.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, I mean, I do quote that Kundera's bit about the eternal recurrence. All I'll say in response to that is I'm surprised that Kundera found it so troubling and weird, because it just doesn't seem a weird idea to me at all. That is all I would say about that. It just seems such a sort of simple way of asserting the importance of this one life. So yeah, I'm just I was surprised that Kundera was so perplexed by it. I actually cut that little bit out of my reading because I thought it was a bit boring for you to listen to me going on about Kundera.
Another question, please. Let's do the woman in the red hat, please, first, and then...
I hope it's an easier question than that last one.
Well, in place of Mona, then, I'll ask you about Burning Man.
Oh, okay, yeah. So, there's a bit so I first went to Burning Man in 1999 when I was living in England, and back then it was overwhelmingly an American event, and even more overwhelmingly a Californian event, I think. And so my girlfriend and I came back from that, complete converts, evangelical about it in a way. And it just about for the next 5 years, when I'd become a complete Burning Man bore, it pretty much destroyed me as a writer, because it was the most important thing in my life and it was indescribable. Anyway, then by 2005, I talk about this in the book, the way that we tend to do things one time too many. So I went for the very last time in 2005, and that ushered in a new phase of my life when I was so happy Labor Day weekend to not be at Burning Man. It was fabulous, and I did all sorts of other things, like, I'd go to these places where you give them money and they give you food. They're called restaurants, and it was just fabulous. Anyway, then I think in about 2017, 2018, one loses track of time, my friend was making a film there and said, did I want to go back? And I really didn't want to, but I thought I would, partly because it was the year that Larry Harvey had died, and I'd become sort of friendly with him. So I went back really for what is not an unusual motive for me in my low life. Well, I went really because it was a free trip, and and I was living here in LA, and of course, in the intervening years, I'd bumped into people who said, "Oh, it's got too commercial," and of course, the people who said that were always people who'd never been. Anyway, so I went, and it was, to sum it up, it was better than ever, actually. I spent even more time than I had in previous years sobbing at the profundity of the experience. And it was really great, and it was so utterly fantastic. And there is no chance of my ever going near that place ever again. So that's it, yeah. I believed again. Now, here's a face I recognize.
Hello, Geoff. How are you?
Hello, Mahmoud.
I have been really thinking about if you got the chance to look at the reflections of Adorno on the late style, and especially Edward Said elaborations of Adorno work. And I'm asking this intentionally because I know you are not a big fan of Edward Said. So how do you think of yourself? Is it funny to find yourself in the same discourse, building a part of the same discourse of others you don't really like?
Yeah, well, of course, that's a great question, Mahmoud. So one thing to make clear is that a lot of work has been done on late style, and I guess the foundational text is Adorno's Late Style in Beethoven. So this is a book, mine is a book not about lateness, but lastness, and sometimes people's last works are late. In Beethoven, his late works are his last works, but we can also think of people whose last works come in what should have been middle age, really. We can even think of people, think of all the books on that NYRB classics list of people's last books, which are also their first books. So people's creative careers can come at various points. And the Adorno essay was such a sort of foundational thing for me. And it's not that my sense of Edward Said is that for me that book, his book, Late Style, he was writing it late in his life, and there's a real falling off there. And it seemed to me that it just didn't deliver what it needed to. And I was really conscious as I read it that it seemed to work best as a sort of as a sort of synoptic piece on Adorno. But I'm in a very different place to Said was really looking death. He was ill. Really thinking about his the end of his days. I'm in that very different position, whereby, I'm getting older. What does that mean? It means my knees ache more, and I don't, I can't write my way out of a hangover in the morning the way I used to in my 20s. So that's that's where I am in relation to that. And I guess I was never completely persuaded of the idea of Said being a writer. He always felt to me very much like a sort of there was always there was an academic quality. Well, he was an academic, and then the work that he did that wasn't like that didn't seem as strong to me as it did to some people. So that book, Under a Last Sky, I felt that just didn't really sort of do it for me. But yeah, I'm glad I got a chance to clarify about late and last. So thank you, Mahmoud.
Sort of a, excuse me. Two-part disjointed question, but one, are you going to see Dylan when he comes to LA in June? And also, of the many things that I've read of yours, one thing that I'm thinking about is the piece you wrote on the spiral jetty and the lightning field. And I wonder if your time here in LA, I'm not sure how many years you've been here, but both those works being in the West, maybe not necessarily going to see art in nature, but have you gotten out and enjoyed some of the great Western beauties that we have here?
Oh yeah. God, it would be. God, wouldn't it be insane if I said no? I just sort of stay in. No, of course, it's part of the. It's this thing that when you've. I think I mentioned it in that piece, but to have access to the Southwest, it's wonderful for you all if you were born here. But I mean, I'm not. But there's something particularly wonderful if, like me, you grew up in this cloud-shrouded little rock in the middle of the Atlantic. Where if you grew up, in Lawrence's phrase, in a country the size of somebody's backyard. So yeah, of course, that's that's a joy. To go back to your question about Dylan, well, I think I should prefix it by saying that I can't think of an artist greater than Bob Dylan. You say, am I going to see him in June or July or whenever it is? He could. I just can't buy into this thing of late Dylan. And the last time I saw him, I really did say never again. And it's not just that I wouldn't want to go to see him, but even the late records I didn't like. And then I did have this kind of revelatory experience of just one track on that last album, Key West, seemed to me to be just have that kind of thing which one does with Dylan. I must have listened to it 100 times, of just caught up in its fathomless mystery, if you like. And that's the only late Dylan song that's really done it for me. Yeah, thank you.
Hi, thank you for your reading earlier, Geoff. I was wondering, you mentioned in the talk earlier that when you were finished with your jazz book, your book on jazz, you were kind of done with jazz at that point. And I'm wondering how you feel about your book on Last Things. I mean, Last Things is kind of a big a big conversation. Are there more things that more last things you're wondering about?
Well, I mean, do you know this book? I mean, there's a bit in that as a sort of joke I make at the end where I say how I wrote to a friend to say I'd finished my book I'd finished my book. And then I say something like, but now I wonder if I got that the wrong way round. Has it finished me? And it really has. It felt like it had really finished me off in a kind of. I really threw the kitchen sink at this book. I got so much stuff off my chest that, I really sort of had my say about so many things, and I'd been as writers, we always have these topics, these things that we want to do, and I'd wanted to write something about Nietzsche and Beethoven and Turner, so it was with a great sense of relief and satisfaction that I'd sort of done that. But then, life goes on, so it occurred to me just recently that I hadn't addressed this question of what happens after the end. And so for those of you who, when you get to the end of this book, have not had enough of me droning on, you'll be glad to know that in the New Statesman in Britain, I've got coming out a 4,000 word piece on my experience of elbow surgery. So yeah, it's there is probably more to come, and yeah. I mean, that's the thing, isn't it? So often we're so familiar with this thing of athletes, who are faced with this terrible thing that they're, the thing that gives their life meaning. It happens so early in their lives, typically at about the age of 30-ish. They can extend it now. In other words, their careers come to an end at roughly the age that one tends to publish one's first novel. And then, of course, they retire, and then that's often unendurable, as Bjorn Borg discovered. What was the first thing Bjorn Borg did on retiring? Was it, well, he'd do it as a quiz, was it to be able to devote himself to reading, the great works? Or was it, oh yeah, it was this. He judged a wet t-shirt contest, which might be okay for an afternoon, but that's not going to give your life meaning, is it? So of course, and we can think of so many examples of athletes who come back, I mean, more, with greater or less, generally lesser degrees of success. Yeah.
I'm curious, as you were exploring all these different writers and athletes and people, were there some that you felt were instructive to you on these last facing mortality? And were there others who you felt were like, I don't want to do it that way?
Yeah, I mean, that's a nice question, because one thing this book isn't, it's not comprehensive. So just on the way up here, Mona was bitching about, why isn't there anything about Philip Roth, or William Trevor, Alice Munro? So, and we could, you could all just, you could write names on a piece of paper and throw them at me and say, well, why not X or Y? Well, because, there's no need to be comprehensive. But one thing that I think is sort of relevant to your to your question, which is this. I mean, one thing, I don't think I have a great sense of mortality. It's not really a book about dying, really, although, of course it ended up being written at a time when, we're back in those scary days of the pandemic, when, that was, I think maybe I'd had a sense of mortality before. I think this is something we all share. I think when my parents, when they both died, and they died in the same year, then that altered my relationship to the world, I think, and that's very, 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 very common. But I think the point in which the point of contact I had with the writers I was writing about would be this, that, typically people do their best work when they're in their 30s, 40s, 50s, 60s maybe, and people continue to publish in their, you can publish in your 80s. James Salter's book, All That Is, I thought was pretty amazing, but it's very unusual if somebody's best work comes, in their 80s. I mean, that's if they're still around to do it. And I was interested in this idea of what it is that enables people to continue to have a long creative life, as opposed to those people that you're mentioning who maybe publish one book and then quit for whatever reason. And it's this kind of balance between, on the one hand, you don't want to be cauterizing your creativity by too strict a kind of critical sense of what's going on. But then it's possible that ability to keep writing, and there's all sorts of people I discuss, might be dependent on the writer being oblivious to what is so clear to readers, namely the often catastrophic decline in quality. And I was very, very conscious as I wrote, and, I talk about this, I mean, with, I think, for me, great, great writer, supremely great writer. For me, DeLillo hasn't written anything that's really done it for me since Underworld. And I sort of used this phrase about his book, cosmopolis. I talk about, the writer's tendency towards self-karaoke. And I was very, very conscious when I was writing this book that everything that I was saying about these other writers, it might turn out that really my diagnosis of their symptoms was actually a form of that I was, possibly falling as deep into self-parody as anyone else I was writing about, and that there might be a decline in quality here, which is really evident to those of you reading the book, but which I was, I've got to say, I was completely unaware of it. I thought I was just on fire writing this book, but then I'm very conscious that Hemingway, when he was writing whatever it was, I can't remember which book, Mona, and he writes to his editor saying, I'm writing again like I'm a 25-year-old. And of course it, when the book came out, people said, God, it's his worst book by miles,
But then again, I mean, Penelope Fitzgerald started publishing and writing in her 60s. I mean, the reason I mentioned Alice Munro was not just because she quit, but because she really did her best work, actually, in her between 60s and 75. Yes. So, I mean, there are other examples.
Yeah, I think it's, there's no, different people do their best work at different stages. But somebody else that I write about a lot in the, well, no, not a lot, but there's a bit in the book about Kerouac, who I have this sort of odd relationship with, and I just wonder if anyone else does. On the Road is the classic book that you read when you're 19, 20, 21 or whatever, and then you grow out of it. Whereas my relationship with that book, which I read every 3 or 4 years, it just gets better and better for me. So that's unusual. But then there's also this thing that I find Kerouac's life so moving in a way, in that, as you all know, he had terrible trouble getting On the Road published. And then, it duly was published after being rejected so much. And, it was a triumph. And then, what did Kerouac write that was of value after On the Road? Well, not very much. And of course, he became this kind of rather sort of ludicrous, buffoonish alcoholic, ends up living with his mum, So on the one hand, that's, he just became, it was a ridiculous and sad life. But for me, the triumph of On the Road indemnified him against ever having made a mistake or making a mistake in his life. And it seems to me that the value of a life can't be assessed chronologically. So that, we've got a really vivid example of this at the moment with poor Boris Becker. Where is he tonight? Well, we all know he's in jail for bankruptcy in England, and he's a sort of ludicrous figure in a way, but, won Wimbledon 3 times by the time he's 22. Anyone in the room won Wimbledon? Or you think of another, think of somebody who rose to heights even greater than, think of Diego Maradona. Can you imagine that to have achieved that much? And then it seems to me, it's not, it's, okay, you just, you blow your brains out on coke and, whatever it is, but it's, what comes after that moment of, it's a question of just enduring that, really, because that, it's actually, if we see it in Nietzschean terms, when he announces the eternal recurrence, and he says something like, somebody says you've got to live your life over and over again. Wouldn't you think that was terrible, he says. And then he says, but have you known a moment in your life that was so great that you would say to the person who said that, you are a god, and I never heard of anything more divine. So you just think of that kind of moment when Diego Maradona lifts the kind of trophy for Argentina or for Napoli, and you'd be mad not to say yes. I'll take it all. I'll take the whole life in order for those moments of, to us, incomprehensible greatness. I think.
Maybe we should end with that. Oh, one more question. Shall we?
maybe this isn't as great a note to end on, but you were earlier introduced as having a theme of giving up that goes through your work. And I kind of coming off of what you just talked about, I was kind of curious of why that was expressed in that way, like, or how giving up is a theme to you, perhaps in this book in particular as well.
You even say at one point that quitting can require enormous discipline.
Yeah, it does. I mean, yeah, in one way that would be a detour. But yeah, I'm just convinced that this will be the last point. The very last thing that Nietzsche did before he went completely gaga, he went through all of his old books, assembling bits that he'd written about Richard Wagner, with whom he'd had a famously kind of fractious relationship. And it occurred to me that I think so many of my books are about giving up and quitting and stopping. I said that, one day I'm going to go through all my books and collect all the passages about quitting and giving up. And then I say, actually, I'll leave that for a while. And then, I really do. I've been saying to my wife for all the time we've been married, which is 21 years now, that I've been finished as a writer. I mean, so when we met, which was the time of Burning Man, that had finished me off. And we could keep going through the various things. So I've been really convinced I've been finished all this while. And I'm convinced that has actually kept me going, that as Mona was saying at the beginning, because of just sort of worrying that I better just get this one more thing done, and then I can give up. And then I'll collapse into I'm quoting myself now, vulgarly. But at that moment, I'll collapse into a form of bliss which is absolutely indistinguishable from the most profound depression. So that was a good point to end on, and I'm glad you...
Thank you so much, Geoff Dyer.
Thank you all. Thank you.
And Geoff will be signing books as well.